But first, we're going to stick here in Ottawa because a number of civil rights groups and legal voices are calling on the Prime Minister to reverse his proposed changes to asylum law. This week, we learned the federal government plans to make it harder for some people to seek asylum in Canada by preventing refugees from making a claim in Canada if they've made similar claims in one of the other Five Eyes countries, which include the U.S. The proposed change is in the government's big budget implementation bill. In a joint letter sent to Justin Trudeau, the groups opposing those changes write, "The measure itself, depriving certain refugee claimants of access to full and independent refugee hearings, is harsh and unnecessary. Furthermore," the letter goes on, "stripping crucial and hard-won human rights protections from people in a budget bill is undemocratic." So, what's the government's response? Bill Blair is the Minister of Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction. He joins me now from the foyer of the House of Commons over in the West Block. Hi, Minister Blair. Wonderful to have you back on the show. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much, Vashi. It's good to be back.
Minister, you said that the proposed changes to the asylum refugee law are designed to prevent asylum seekers from, quote, shopping around and making applications in multiple countries. Former Minister of Immigration Lloyd Axworthy, was on our show yesterday, and he responded to those remarks. I want to play a clip of that and then get your response. Take a listen.
That's an offensive statement. I know it was done by a minister of the Crown, but I think I'm old enough and been around enough. You know, there's so much effort to put the onus back on refugees as if somehow they're out there shopping to get in.
So, Minister Blair, Mr. Axworthy called your statement offensive. How do you respond?
Well, I think it's important to understand what it is precisely we're talking about. First of all, Canada maintains a very robust and fair asylum system. We're very proud that Canada is a place that is open to those who need protection, and that we're working very hard to make sure that our asylum determination system is accessible and efficient to provide protection to those who truly need it. But there is also a very well-established policy and principle of asylum primacy, and we want to encourage people to make a claim for asylum. Those who need protection make a claim at the first possible opportunity, and for those who have already made a claim in a safe country. And as Mr. Axworthy explained, for people who are fleeing war and terror and persecution, Canada is a safe and welcoming country, and we do provide refuge to those who need protection. But if people are already in a safe place, we want them to pursue their claim for asylum in that place, so it does not impede those who come to Canada in need of our protection from obtaining a hearing and a resolution in a quick period of time. And I also want to be very, very clear that for those who are deemed not eligible, they are still entitled to a very robust system of pre-removal risk assessment in which they can have
but
legal
not a full hearing, right?
But they are entitled to legal counsel. They are entitled to a face-to-face hearing to determine if there is a risk. They are also entitled to judicial review of that decision. But most importantly, if any claimant is determined to be at risk, they will be given protection by Canada. So we're not going to be putting anyone in jeopardy. If there's a risk, they'll receive our protection. But we want to encourage people to make their claim for asylum in the first safe country to which they arrive. And we've had about 3,000 people who have actually made claims in the United States, lived there for a number of years, even had children there, who are now making application for asylum in Canada. They've come from the United States.
But you know there could be a reason for that, and it's around that term safe place that a lot of critics have questions, because the idea is that you're deeming the U.S. necessarily a safe place for people who are seeking asylum. And there are a lot of questions around the current administration's policies where asylum seekers are concerned. Just take a look at what's happening on the southern border in that country, where they are reconsidering formalizing family separation again, reportedly, right? I think the concern raised by critics is that really necessarily such a quote-unquote safe place?
And I can tell you that there is well-established international criteria for determining a safe country. We've consulted very broadly with UNHCR, for example. And the United States still remains very much a safe country and a country that abides by the rule of law. They already have, many hundreds of thousands of people who have sought asylum in that country, and by all the criteria, it remains a safe place. And when an asylum seeker gets to a safe place, the principle should be that they make an application in that place and follow through in their processes. We want to make sure that for those who come to Canada seeking asylum in Canada, they have an opportunity to have that hearing determination in a timely way and in an efficient way. We have a responsibility always to live up to our international obligations, to provide protection to those who need asylum in Canada. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to manage and operate the system in as efficient way as possible and to maintain the security of our borders and the confidence of Canadians that our asylum system is well functioning, it is compassionate and caring to those who need protection.
Minister, I understand that, but with respect, I have to challenge the idea around everything being status quo in the United States. The Trump administration, for example, has actively tried to remove domestic abuse as a form of persecution on which an individual can make an asylum claim in that country. Is that necessarily a safe place for everyone with an administration that's trying to remove domestic abuse as a reason for fleeing somewhere?
Well, again, the United States is a place where people have sought and obtained refuge. It is a country governed by the rule of law, and they have a well-functioning system of asylum determination.
So you have no questions about the current administration and its approach to asylum?
We continue to monitor carefully every country's determination as a safe place, and by all criteria, the United States remains a safe place. But I also want to assure Canadians that our system is not going to put people at risk. And if people have come to this country before they would be returned to their home country, an assessment is done through a pre-removal risk assessment process in which they are entitled to legal counsel. It's a hearing properly conducted according to our laws and according to the Human Rights Code. And people, if they are determined to have been at risk, they will receive our protection.
As you heard there, I spoke with Minister of Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction Bill Blair off the top of the show about the government's recent move to toughen up rules for asylum seekers. Essentially, Evan, what they have proposed, they attached it to the budget implementation bill, is that if you have first sought asylum, filed an asylum claim in one of the Five Eyes countries, which includes the U.S., if you then tried to come to Canada and do the same thing, you'd be rejected. And they're being criticized by a lot of refugee advocates, even Lloyd Axworthy, former Minister of Immigration, on the show yesterday, because the way that they've sort of tried to justify it is they don't want, quote unquote, asylum shopping happening here. Minister Blair sort of doubled down on the idea that the U.S. is a safe place, is somewhere where we consider if you file your asylum claim there, it's the same. It should be just as safe as filing it in Canada. There are a lot of people who question that right now, though.
You know, I think it depends. If you compare the United States with Canada, it certainly is a less welcoming environment for refugees, and we know that President Trump and Stephen Miller would like to make it a lot less welcoming. I mean, we just saw the head of the U.S. Border Service resign. Kristen Nielsen, the Department of Homeland Security, had resigning over her refusal to simply exclude asylum claimants from the United States and keep them on the other side of the border, which would have been counter to U.S. law. It's worth pointing out, though, that her refusal doesn't mean that the law is now going to be broken. In fact, all previous efforts by Donald Trump
stopped by the courts.
Have been stopped by the courts. And in fact, you know, many of the migrants who are coming to Canada and making refugee claims here are people who cross the border from Mexico, are then detained and given a date for a hearing in the United States, but then skip out on the hearing and head straight for the border of Manitoba or Quebec in some cases. So these are not people who are being prevented a chance to apply in the United States. They're people who'd rather apply in Canada than in the US. I mean, I know because I've met some of those people. I've met them in Mexico. So the United States system, well, let's compare it to not Canada's, but Mexico's. It's a lot more generous than the Mexican refugee system. Mexico has almost never accepted refugees. It's getting record numbers of applications, and this year it just cut its budget for the department that handles refugees. And in fact, if looking around the world, the United States is actually somewhere in the middle of the pack of Western countries in its treatment of refugees and asylum claims. So people are right when they compare it to Canada to say that it is a tougher environment, but I think we do also have to recognize it's not a lawless environment.
Right.
And it's also worth pointing out that a lot of the people who've been showing up between border posts in Canada are not people who've made claims in
3,000 of the 40,000.
That's right.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of them are in the category of the temporary protected status in the United States. People who, for example, were given special visas, permission to stay after Hurricane Mitch in Central America or other. That's right, the earthquake in Haiti, the earthquake in Managua, and so on. So all of those people would still qualify in Canada. And those were the large groups that started crossing the Canadian border. So, one should neither exaggerate how bad the situation is in the United States, nor exaggerate how much this measure is going to change the situation at our border.
Why do you think then, Tim, the government is taking flack over this? I mean, they've also attached it, and they're getting criticized for attaching it to the budget implementation bill rather than introducing it separately and having a full debate on it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not particularly fussed about how it's not like it ended up being a surprise. We're talking about it right now. So, but I think what the reality is, the government is responding to, I think, some degree of concern, especially out of Quebec, about the number of refugees that were crossing the border and wanted to. And I think you'll see the government's taken a whole bunch of measures to deal with it. The numbers have dropped, but wanted to make sure that it had kind of addressed one more issue of concern. And I think, I think Evan's point is fair, which is you can't exaggerate on either side. I think it won't be, this isn't like the magic solution that solves it. It'll be a few thousand people that are affected. But I think it's another tool that the government is putting in place so it can say, look, we've taken a series of steps to responsibly manage this system in the context of obviously being a welcoming country. And so we've got a controlled process, one that has a decent number of mechanics for controlling the number, but also allows people with legitimate claims to make sure that they can make claims here and be treated properly in Canada.
Melissa, does that message, do you think that message will work?
Well, it's a message the Conservatives been using for 3.5 years now, when they've raised concerns over over the illegal border crossers across the country.
They're not illegal.
And
right there.
And
the act is illegal. That they themselves are not. They're crossing in between points of entry.
In terms of what the Liberals have called that, they've used words like un-Canadian and racist. And anytime any concern has been raised, the Liberals have just shouted things like white nationalism to shut down this debate. In terms of where this goes, look, it's almost vindication for the Conservatives. I don't think it's going far enough, but I think it has a lot less to do in terms of the numbers in Quebec, and it probably has more to do with the polling numbers in Quebec and how angry Quebec is about the border situation.
It's an interesting point that Melissa raises, Marchelle, because and I don't know if I'd frame it in exactly the same way, but every time the criticism came up, even around the Safe Third Country Agreement, which is, of course, the loophole is what allows people to basically walk through in between official points of entry. At first, they wouldn't even say that they were looking at opening it up or redoing it, and now we find out that they are in negotiation. So the messaging has shifted over the past number of months.
Oh, 100% it shifted. I think Melissa's nailed it. This has a lot to do with electoral politics, and in particular Quebec. I think that it must be, it's pretty good news if you're a Conservative, if the Liberal government's sort of capitulating this whole way. To Evan and Tim's point, yeah, sure, I could also agree that we shouldn't get too hot on either side of this, but the people who have been the hottest in a lot of these conversations happen to be the Liberal government and their allies. So, they can't now tell us just to calm down. I think also from the NDP's perspective, what a gift, right? Because we've just gone through this process around the lab scam, and in particular the treatment of Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philippot. And so now we can say, well, Prime Minister Trudeau, not as feminist as you think, Canada. Also, maybe not as far away from Trump as you might think in terms of how he's prepared to deal with this global refugee crisis. Maybe he's not as progressive as you thought.
Although that might be a bit of a stretch compared to family separation policy and your Homeland Security Secretary resigning.
I'm just saying there's a good commercial in there somewhere.
Okay, and on that point, I'll wrap things up. Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much to the Power Panel.
No problem.
Tim Murphy, Melissa Landsman, Marcella Monroe, and Evan Dyer.